If it feels like something has shifted quietly inside the American system over the last few weeks, you are not imagining it. It is not a dramatic rupture or a visible crisis on the evening news. It is a subtle, relentless tightening of the gears. In Washington, conversations have become shorter and more cautious. In the high-rise corridors of Wall Street, legal teams are reviewing exposure scenarios that, until recently, were considered purely theoretical. Inside federal agencies, planning cycles are accelerating, not because of a declared emergency, but because of an emerging risk that does not fit traditional threat models. This is not about war. It is not about sanctions. It is not even about diplomacy in the conventional sense. It is about legitimacy, specifically how American power is perceived when it stops being an abstraction and becomes operational, embodied in borders, visas, surveillance protocols, and executive authority. The United States is preparing to host the world's largest sporting event, but inside the system, there is a growing awareness that this event is no longer just a tournament. It has become a mirror, and the reflection is creating deep discomfort in parts of Europe and a state of heightened alertness inside Washington. What is unfolding is not a cultural dispute or a temporary protest wave. It is a test of whether American power can still separate spectacle from sovereignty. Behind closed doors, U.S. institutions are fully aware of what is being tested. We are witnessing the friction that occurs when the default platform of the world, the United States, begins to be viewed by its closest allies as a conditional environment. This is the story of that friction and what it reveals about the current state of the American machine. The public narrative surrounding the current tension with Europe is predictably narrow. If you follow mainstream media, the story appears to be about personalities. You are told that European politicians are reacting to rhetoric, or that activists are calling for a boycott of the World Cup based on ideological opposition to the Trump administration. The public is told that this is a matter of style, that emotions are driving the discussion, and that the controversy will naturally fade once the games begin. But this is where the public narrative breaks down. Inside the American power structure, these events are interpreted not as emotional outbursts, but as strategic signals. Institutions do not react to outrage. They react to recalibration. The concern inside Washington is not that a boycott will empty the stadiums. The concern is why the idea is being entertained at all by mainstream political actors in allied countries. States do not casually discuss boycotting a global event hosted by their primary security guarantor. They do so only when participation begins to carry a perceived political, reputational, or operational risk. Behind the scenes, this is treated as a signal of strategic hesitation. When European officials begin to question the wisdom of sending their national teams or high-level delegations to American soil, they are signaling a shift in their internal risk assessment. They are calculating whether association with the current American operational posture, its immigration policies, its surveillance standards, and its assertive executive style carries a cost that outweighs the benefits of participation. Washington understands this perfectly. The signal is that the American platform is no longer being accepted as a neutral, frictionless stage for global engagement. There was no single announcement that triggered this moment. It was not a specific law or a single speech. Instead, this moment emerged through accumulation. It is the convergence of several policy shifts that, while defensible individually, have formed a pattern that European institutions can no longer ignore. The key trigger event is the recent integration of federal enforcement protocols into the logistics of the World Cup itself. Specifically, the growing tendency to link international sporting visas and fan entry requirements directly to broader federal surveillance and data collection practices has created a point of no return. In previous cycles, there was an assumed buffer between the political executive and the technical administration of global events. That buffer has worn thin. When European officials look at the current U.S. posture, characterized by a presidency that openly frames international engagement in terms of leverage, they see a collapse of institutional distance. What made this moment different from previous controversies was the realization that the hosting of the World Cup is being treated by the U.S. federal state as an exercise of sovereignty rather than an act of international hospitality. For European governments, this shifted the discussion from political disagreement to procedural anxiety. They are asking whether participation in the event will be interpreted as tacit alignment with U.S. domestic policies that are controversial within their own borders. Once that question enters an official cabinet briefing in Berlin or Paris, the nature of the relationship has fundamentally changed. The institutional reaction inside the United States reveals a system protecting its core interests. Inside the White House, the response has been measured and firm. There is no public retreat as the administration maintains that U.S. sovereignty and its enforcement of federal law are not subject to external political pressure. This is a matter of maintaining the image of a strong executive. At the same time, contingency planning is underway across the board. In Congress, the reaction is split along familiar lines, but beneath the theater, there is a shared concern about the thinning of American soft power. Intelligence agencies are focused on the precedent this sets. Their concern is whether international events can now be used by allies as tools of informal constraint, a way to signal limits without invoking formal diplomatic ruptures or sanctions. The Pentagon views the situation through the lens of alliance cohesion, not because of the sport itself, but because symbolic fractures in cultural and sporting arenas often serve as early indicators of deeper fractures in security coordination. If allies are willing to hesitate on a soccer tournament, the question arises, what else are they willing to hesitate on? Financial institutions, meanwhile, are tracking the risk of these events becoming politicized liability environments. They are assessing the potential impact on insurance, sponsorship contracts, and cross-border transactions. What this actually reveals is systemic behavior. Major U.S. institutions are responding to the erosion of the assumption that the U.S. platform is a neutral space. To understand why this is happening, we must look at the structural power dynamic. American power operates on two levels: hard power, military, financial, and enforcement capacity, E, and what we might call ambient power, legitimacy, attraction, and the sense of inevitability. Global events like the World Cup are designed to reinforce that second layer. They project the United States as a stable, open, and default stage for human achievement. What is shifting now is the perception of conditionality. Allied actors are signaling that access to American platforms may increasingly carry a political interpretation. This introduces friction into a system that was built to feel frictionless. This shift is not accidental. It reflects long-term structural incentives. We see an executive approach that emphasizes leverage over reassurance. We see federal institutions aligning more closely with centralized authority. We see a security framework that prioritizes control and data collection over openness. Together, these forces sharpen American power. They do not make it weaker in a hard sense, but they make it more cutting. And sharp power inevitably generates resistance. The military-industrial logic of the U.S. state has always prioritized security and leverage, but the spectacle of soft power used to provide a necessary mask. As that mask slips, the structural reality of American power, its focus on data, its emphasis on executive discretion, and its monetization of access becomes visible to everyone. This generates a defensive reaction from other states that are trying to preserve their own autonomy. The consequences for the United States are profound. Domestically, this tension reinforces polarization. One side interprets international resistance as proof of a strong, uncompromising executive, while the other sees it as a dangerous overreach that isolates the nation. This deepens the instability of the domestic political base. Economically, we see pressure points emerging in event-based revenue models. Uncertainty affects tourism, infrastructure investment, and insurance premiums for large-scale projects. If the U.S. is no longer seen as a default host, the long-term economic value of its soft power platforms begins to depreciate. Strategically, the United States is confronting a question it has avoided for decades. Is legitimacy a renewable asset or a finite one? Global credibility is not just about the ability to win a conflict. It is about the ease with which partners publicly associate with your leadership. When that association becomes a political liability for a European prime minister, the U.S. loses a form of leverage that cannot be replaced by military spending. Strategic sovereignty is a zero-sum game. The more the U.S. asserts unilateral control over international platforms, the more its partners look for alternatives. Public trust in institutions, both at home and abroad, is the silent variable. When external feedback is framed exclusively as hostility, institutional learning slows down. Systems that stop learning eventually become brittle. Placing this moment in a historical frame, we can see that it is not unprecedented, but it is unique in its scale. In the 1970s, American legitimacy eroded during the Vietnam era. In the early 2000s, it happened again following the unilateral decision-making that led to the Iraq War. In both cases, the inflection point was not a lack of power, but the perception that the U.S. was operating without regard for the collective norms of its alliance structure. What differs now is the speed and the arena. In the past, these tensions were managed through slow-moving diplomatic cables. Today, they circulate instantly through digital narratives. Symbolic actions, such as the discussion of a World Cup boycott, serve as a substitute for formal opposition. We are witnessing a systemic transition. We are moving from a world where the United States was the unquestioned host and default stage to a world where it is a contested platform. This is not a temporary crisis that will vanish with a change in the news cycle. It is a structural shift in how American power is managed. Historically, systems often underestimate this phase, the phase where legitimacy must be actively defended rather than passively assumed, until the transition is complete. In conclusion, the central issue is not whether Europe will follow through with a full-scale boycott. The real issue is that the idea has become a plausible topic of high-level political discussion. Behind closed doors in Washington, this is understood as more than just a sports controversy. It is an indicator of whether American power still benefits from passive acceptance. Understanding this moment requires moving beyond the noise of outrage and loyalty. It requires clarity. Power does not disappear when it is challenged. It adapts. How the United States responds to this symbolic resistance will shape how all future challenges to its platforms are framed. The system is currently deciding whether to double down on leverage or to reinvest in reassurance. Is America prepared for a world where its platforms are no longer assumed to be neutral? And more importantly, is it prepared for a world where its legitimacy must be continuously negotiated, even with its closest allies? Share your analysis in the comments. If you want a deeper look at how American power functions beneath the surface of the headlines, subscribe to U.S. Power Report. In our next analysis, we will examine how global financial institutions are quietly repositioning their assets in response to U.S. political risk, and what that means for American leverage abroad. Stay focused.